Okay, welcome everybody to this session as part of Transport and Climate Change Week, led by GIZ. And this is the Asian Active Mobility session, which for anyone who knows me, we're all about active mobility. I'm Bronwyn Thornton, Chief Exec of Walk21, and you're very welcome to the very interesting discussion that we're going to be having today. It's my pleasure to invite our first speaker to make some opening remarks, Mr. Daniel Herman from GIZ. He's the head of the Climate Policy Unit in Vietnam and the Chief Technical Advisor on support for implementation of the Paris Agreement. Many thanks, Daniel.
Yes, then good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are. Now then, I would also like to welcome you to the Asian Active Mobility session as part, as Brown already mentioned, the Transport and Climate Change Week. This specific session is hosted by GIZ Vietnam, or more specifically the Public Bike Sharing Development Partnership under the Develop DE program together with Walk21. And this also gives me the honor to be speaking these opening remarks today, as the Public Bike Sharing Program is part of our climate policy section. What is the reason for, it might be too obvious, but what is the reason for today's session? Of course, as a close to zero emission mode of urban transport, active mobility seems like an ideal solution and should merit the highest priority, not the least because of all the co-benefits that go along with air and noise pollution, congestion, and also health outcomes. But it's of course also known that to achieve substantial modal shifts is a complex and complicated matter. And walking and cycling in Asia has not always received the attention it should merit, and from local governments. And also such issues then related as road safety for cyclists and pedestrians is not generally reflected in discussions about road design, construction, and urban planning in general. So today, the aim is to share potential tools and approaches to bring active mobility on the political agenda, and including such measures or approaches as data for policy dialogue with local government, enabling strategic policy frameworks, and innovative community participatory approaches. And we will hear from a range of established practitioners and policymakers from both Asia and Europe on their respective perspective on good practices to promote active mobility. And I would like to already thank the speakers of today's session for their inputs and insights, but also the colleagues from GIZ and Walk21 for making this session today a reality and preparing it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel. And yes, nobody can underemphasize the importance of walking and cycling for the climate agenda, and sessions like this move it into the spotlight as much as we can. So we're going to hear now from a city that is actively working to do something about walking and cycling in their city. And we're going to hear from Mr. Robert Anthony, who's head of department for transport in Pasig in the Philippines. We will be taking questions about his presentation at the end. So please, if you've got some that brew as he's sharing his words with us, then pop them in the chat and we can bring them to the conversation. So I'm very pleased to hand over now to Mr. Anthony.
Hi, Brahman, how are you? Nice to be
Great.
here.
There you go. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry. Shall I be sharing my screen?
I'm not sure what this technical system is.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I can get it going.
Sure.
Great.
I think that you should share your screen. If you can say it and make it by yourself. Otherwise, I think our colleague will help with the moving your slide.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
I can. I'm just trying to see if I can get my screen share. It's a little it's a I can't seem to come up with the window here. Just a second.
Okay, so I think let my colleague to help you. Anh ơi, can you have Mr. Anthony to share the screen, his presentation?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I think you guys might have a copy of the slides.
Yeah. Sure. Okay.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you very much. Wonderful. So thank you very much, guys. It's always a pleasure to share what we're doing in Pasig with everyone else from around the world. It's a Pasig City, to give everyone background, you know, really quickly, is a city of 800,000 people in the middle of Metro Manila. So we are one city among 17 in the Metro Manila greater urban region, which comprises about 22 million people, depending on the time of day. But for today's presentation, I won't dwell too long on that. I just want to talk a little bit about the framework for which we are executing a lot of like walking and cycling policy, and talking about maybe some of the gains we've made, and about how we're trying to move forward with improving that in our city. So next slide, please. So yeah, here's a little background about our office. We are the Sustainable Mobility Office of Pasig City, dealing with walking, cycling, public transport, and e-mobility. And as anyone in the space learns after spending enough time, all of these goals are really quite interrelated. So working on walking and cycling really helps improve public transportation, e-mobility, and vice versa. So next slide, please. So I think we can like skip over some of these background slides a little bit. You can skip over to the vision for Pasig City streets. So we can start here. Yes, okay, we can start here. All right, so next slide, please. So in Pasig City, basically, we are a historic more than 400-year-old city. We've got historic districts and built-up areas, and we really are quite dense for a city with 800,000 people and only about 22 square kilometers. So while we've really got like all that density, all that built-up area, road crashes have, after we saw like a slight downtick in road crashes from 2019 to 2020, we do have some road safety issues to work on. Crash fatalities have gotten up in recent years, and this really shows the importance of working strongly on walking and cycling as a way to counteract the issue of road safety, which as we all know, isn't just a transportation issue, but a health issue and an environmental issue as well. And the quality of active and public transport modes right now are still quite inadequate. Again, this is a impetus for us to keep working on walking and cycling. And for our general approach, we basically sum it up like, to improve mobility outcomes in the city, we have to make the best use of our current road infrastructure, again, which is composed of historic streets and also heavily built up districts. Make the best use of it through upgrades that make it safe for all road users and convenient for active and public transport trips. Next slide, please. So here's a tree chart version of our vision. So if our objective is to provide access to a safe, affordable, and sustainable transport system, we have basically three main sub goals under that: to establish an intra and intercity bike lane network, to provide safe and inclusive transport services, and to reduce our road crash deaths by 50% in the next 5 years. So what we're trying to do, in addition to that, is to make sure that towards building out our bike lane network, we want to make sure that 100% of our roads, all of our roads, have two or more traffic lanes, have protected bike lanes. We want to make sure that all of our government buildings, including the city hall, schools, and hospitals, are connected by bike lanes, and that 100% of our street intersections in the next 5 years are made in the next 2 years are made accessible to pedestrians and people with disabilities, and for 75% of sidewalks and streets with more than 2 traffic lanes, to create good shelter provided through trees or other shade by 2026. Next slide, please. So we're really trying to start a paradigm shift here, where in the Philippines, a lot of transportation and traffic management thinks that pedestrians and cyclists are nuisances that have to be managed. What we're really trying to move towards is to make sure that pedestrians and cyclists are beneficial and should be encouraged. And towards this, we're really trying to flip the script here and make sure that we look after pedestrians and cyclists and try to see them as a good positive indicator species, as opposed to shunting them to the side for the sake of vehicle movement. And as we all know, that when you design a street for pedestrians and cyclists as opposed to vehicle movement, it works better for everybody, including people who drive motor vehicles. Next slide, please. So our design philosophy for active transport really has some three key principles. That number one, all streets of Pasig City have to be accessible by bicycle. Streets of sufficient width, again, using the 2-lane standard I mentioned earlier, will have protected bike lanes, and that the streets which are narrower than that, again, noting that we have quite a number of historic, very narrow horse carriage side streets in our historic district, that these streets will be will have the appropriate traffic calming measures and lowered posted speed limits. Next slide, please. So we've got a pretty good active transport program going. Next slide. Here we've got a small chart of Pasig City, small map of Pasig City with our existing painted bike lanes and our existing protected bike lanes. And as we know that if you count all these lanes together, we've got more than 54 kilometers of bike lanes, and we're really trying to work on getting all of these bike lanes upgraded to protected bike lanes as much as possible. Next slide, please. Here we have a wider network showing not just our bike lanes, but our existing bike lanes, but our future planned bike lanes and our identified slow streets where it's too narrow to have a protected bike lane. So we take on the approach of traffic calming and lower speed limits to ensure that they continue to be safe for active transport users. Next slide, please. And this is actually where it gets really exciting for us, because when we did our bike counts recently, one thing that we discovered and one thing that gives us a lot of motivation to continue to improve our walking and cycling facilities is that we have really high bike modal share in Pasig City. On some of our streets, we have bike modal share of upwards of 20%, and we don't really see bike modal share go below 10% on any of our main roads. And this is really encouraging for us because again, we mentioned that we're observing these bicycle counts before we put in a really high standard of bicycle infrastructure, at least not where we really want to be at. Next slide, please. So just to share, Amang Rodriguez is one of the main north-south streets in Pasig City. We do our peak hour counts in the morning and in the evening. And one thing we see is that during the peak hour, you see bidirectional bicycle traffic count of over 1,000 cyclists in both directions during the peak hours, and that's really encouraging to us. Next slide, please. So when you do like a three-hour peak count to capture the entire peak period, in the mornings and in the evenings, you see almost 1,000 cyclists per hour for the entire peak period, and that's really again really encouraging for us, and evidence which we continue to collect to be able to organize and get the political capital to get over some of the resistance to bike lanes in some of the communities that we're trying to build in. Next slide, please. On Sandoval Avenue, this is another street where you don't actually have bike lanes at all, but we recently discovered that this could actually be our bicycle superhighway, where during the peak hour in the evening, in the mornings and the evenings, you've got over 1,000 cyclists in both directions, and in the evenings, you've got even almost 2,000 cyclists going in both directions. And again, for those of you familiar with the CRO manual, this is actually several times the threshold for the highest standard of bicycle infrastructure as prescribed by the CRO manual for bicycle traffic. Next slide, please. So again, like when you expand the counts the entire peak period, it just gets really encouraging. I think for even for many cities in Europe where you observe I guess like that are much more known for bicycle infrastructure, these would be high numbers even for a lot of European cities. So this gives us a lot of encouragement and a lot of motivation to keep doing what we're doing. Next slide, please. So we've got the entire vehicle modal share just to show our active transport program, where bikes on Sandoval Avenue easily make up more than a quarter of all traffic, with motorcycles, of course, being the most dominant vehicle mode on the streets, as is the case for many places in Asia at this time. Next slide, please. So here we have an example of our upgraded protected intersection that we see in one of the business districts in Pasig, and this is the standard to which we're trying to build our intersections in the future, with expansive pedestrian crossings, with marked spaces for bike crossing, and just to make sure that just to make sure that active transport users can get up and down really easily and really safely. Next slide, please. So we also have a big public bike rack project. Last year we deployed more than 1,000 bike parking slots worth, over 210 public bike racks around government buildings, and 5 more sheltered bike racks around the City Hall and the Central Business District. Next slide, please. We've got the map here of some of the density of our bike parking, and this does not include existing bike parking and private establishments. But of course, we do recognize that bike parking is also one area that we're really trying to improve, really trying to reach a really world-class standard when it comes to providing quantity. So this is another program which we're definitely going to continue in the coming months and years. Next slide, please. So we also distributed bikes to skeleton staff. This is really successful in helping maintain reliability of transportation during the COVID-19 pandemic, when a lot of transportation was not so reliable. So we're looking also to expand this program and to encourage more cycling especially among essential workers in the case of a future emergency situation like that. Next slide,
2
please.
minutes, please, Mr. Anthony.
Sure,
2
no problem.
minutes. Thanks.
Yep. So we've also got an open streets program trying to get people to enjoy streets for people, especially on weekends. We want to expand this program out from our main street in the CBD out to more streets in the city to give people more space to enjoy as public space, as opposed to space that's taken over by motor vehicles. Next slide, please. We also do free bike lessons. This has been a really popular program for us. It's something we want to encourage to get more adults into cycling, where not knowing how to ride a bike, we've observed is a big barrier for a lot of people. Next, please. So for policy background, we have a number of issuances in the Philippines. Maybe we can, I can get into these if people want to ask. I think maybe we can skip over this. I can go into them if people are curious about Philippine policy, since time is running up a little. Next, please. Yep, I can skip this. We can I can probably answer more questions if people are curious. Yeah, I think Rowan, that might be whatever's left might be a little long to get into. I can answer questions about policy background in case people are curious. So thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. That's so interesting. And the policy background is really critical to probably the sort of the framing of some of this session is how do we get cities engaged and making this work happen? And you've clearly got a really solid policy background there, national policy, active mobility policy, a city ordinance to do this work. So it's really impressive to see. I want to open the question. You said that you already have 10% of cycling, which is a great starting point. Many countries, that's their ambition, their long-term ambition. What's your ambition for cycling with this program? Where do you want to see that 10% go?
Yeah, sure. You know, a lot of people ask me this. I think there are other cities in the Philippines that are known for having nice-looking cycling infrastructure. I think what we really want to emphasize is that, yeah, we do want to have a target for cycling modal share. I think actually when you look at the aspirations of, let's say, I believe in Copenhagen, it's around 30% or 40% right now. I think that could be within reach for us, especially since we're observing more than 20% modal share during peak hours on infrastructure that isn't where we want it to be yet. So I think if we can really get the quality of our infrastructure up, I don't think 30-35% is out of the question for us. I think that's really where I want to be after we develop our infrastructure.
I love that ambition. That's fantastic. Copenhagen definitely sets the bar in this regard, and I like that you're not thinking it can't be done where you are. We have another question in the chat from Mega Kusuma, which is, how did you prevent accidents for the cycling? How did you socialize this progress with the car drivers? How do you balance that sort of relationship between car drivers and cycling for that sort of cultural shift and safety outcomes?
Yeah, I think anybody in the space, when you're in the space, you are aware that that's a relationship that has to be managed. I think how healthy it is depends on what country you're in. I think in the Philippines, at least, I would say that some of the cities that have done it, admittedly a little better than us, are the cities where where you see a lot of cyclists, I think there's nothing that that improves that relationship more than just getting lots of cyclists onto the road. So funnily enough, I think some of the other cities in the Metro Manila where I think we've seen improvements is where you have a lot of recreational cyclists, where you encourage a lot of cycling tourism, so that car drivers just get used to seeing cyclists on the road. I think maybe that's also that gets really important, and I think maybe it's also important to for us, of course, we're not just targeting the recreational market. We're really trying to get transportation, commuting cyclists up. And I think one thing, I think really nothing helps get people more accepting of cyclists than to see more and more cyclists on the road and to help normalize it. So I think besides building the infrastructure, we're trying to communicate our bicycle counts better and to really show that there are a lot of cyclists and that cyclists aren't going away, basically.
Yeah, I think this is a good point, but I think you need the infrastructure there to really engage, to communicate in the build as well as in the activity.
Absolutely.
That's priority. We have one last question, and just a very quick answer is the rise of e-bikes. Do you see the e-bikes coming on board in Pasig City? When you have your, the motorbikes, is this sort of in-between vehicle on the rise there or not?
I think it's certainly on the rise, and I think we do want to see more of it. It's especially popular among seniors and people with disabilities, since they operate at lower speeds, lower torque. It tends to be easier on the body for a lot of these riders. So definitely seeing a lot more of that.
Great. And it would be remiss of me not to ask about walking and whether you have any particular plans, investments, or interventions for your walking population.
Absolutely. We tend to focus a lot on cycling, but when it comes to walking, we are embarking on upgrading a lot of our intersections to make sure that crossing the street on major roads is a lot more safer for pedestrians, especially people with disabilities. On a number of streets in Pasig, we're really trying to upgrade the quality of our sidewalks. Some of them are actually built way too high right now, so when they're renovated, we're trying to get the curbs down to the street, down to a more acceptable standard, so it's not like you're standing on the edge of a cliff as it sometimes feels. So, so things like that, making sure that you've got more curb cuts and ramps, a lot of that stuff, trying to get that done.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. It's a really inspiring session, presentation for today. So thank you very much. We're going to move now to China, and I'm very pleased to introduce, thanks. We're going to move to China, and I'm very pleased to introduce Ms. Chenzi Yiyang, who is the technical advisor for GIZ in China. And she's going to be talking about a study that she's done on national active mobility and the active mobility friendly cities assessment indicators. So over to you, Chenzi.
Thank you. Are you able to see the presentation?
Yes, that's great. Yes, please go ahead.
Perfect. Good morning and good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to share some of the interim outputs of our current study on active mobility in China. First of all, we are the Sino-German Cooperation on Low Carbon Transport Project. We aim at supporting Chinese policymakers at different levels to further decarbonize the transport sector. Against this background of China's ambitious CO2 peaking goal in 2030 and 2060 carbon neutrality goals, we supported the study on active mobility. We implement the study in cooperation with the China Academy of Transport Sciences of the Ministry of Transport and Sinocarbon. The study conducted from July last year and will finish in this July. First, about the objectives and the structure. The objective lies in four folds: to promote active mobility as one of the key modes of sustainable transport, to analyze the current status and challenges, to come up with an active mobility assessment indicator system and apply it in Beijing, Xiamen, and Chengdu, and at last to form a comprehensive national active mobility strategy, which is lacking, including long-term goals, governance system. Our aim is to have a strategy that's benchmarked to the national cycling strategy of Germany 3.0. Based on that, our study divides in 4 aspects. First, we have analysis of current issues, then the indicator system, city pilot. In the end, all of this would come into the national active mobility strategy. Well, I think I can skip the definition on active mobility. Just about the localizing of the concept based on the policy framework in China and current trends. We are really focusing not on any forms of human-powered transport, but we focus on cycling, walking, plus electric scooters, which I will mention later, which plays a very key role in urban transport in China now. Many of you might know that China used to be the kingdom of bicycles. Following our discussion from Anthony's presentation, I would first like to draw you to this table on the right corner. You can see that even though it's in Chinese, you can see that this is the modal split of cycling in the 1980s in main cities in China. In most of the cities, it's above 30%, and in many of them, it reaches even 50%. This is the dream for us all, I guess. Unfortunately, if you move up to this graph above, you can see that, sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can, it's fine. But
Okay.
if anyone is joining, please make sure you've muted as you come into the session. Thank you.
All right, I'll continue. If you look at the green section of this bar chart, you can see that that's the modal split for bicycle. It's reduced from 62%, over 62% in 1986 to around 12% in 2015. This is for the city of Beijing. And in terms of total bicycle ownership, in 1995, which was a peak in history, there are 670 million bicycles in China. And this number dropped to 290 million in 2014. However, in recent years, bicycles are coming back. By end of 2020, there are 400 million bicycle ownership in China and 300 million of electric scooters. I would go to the next slide. The comeback of bicycle is thanks to a huge internet mobile phone-based boom of the dockless bike sharing initiative started by private capitals. It started in 2015, and by 2019, there are already over 300 million registered users for these platforms in over 360 cities in China. They are convenient, flexible, they're shared. Many people love them. However, there are also lots of issues related to bike sharing. In the first stage of development, it was a bloody battle among different capitals to take the market share. Many of the well-known names disappeared very soon after the market share battle. And you can see in the first photo on the left side, many bikes were scrapped and they wasted resources. In the last couple of years, the market entered into a more stable phase. However, there's still lots of issues such as unclear business model, inorderly parking, insufficient maintenance, and also similar to all apps, the data security issues. A second feature of e-bike booming in China is the electric scooters. As you can see on the picture, there are more scooters on the road than cars. And in total number, we see 300 million electric two-wheelers in China. That's the number is more than car ownership. They're good for long distance, easier, as Anthony mentioned, I won't repeat. Many people adopt for this, especially in smaller cities in China and for groups with less income. However, it also brings lots of issues, safety issues not only related to traffic on the road, but also the industrial standard. There are lots of substandard e-bikes and scooters on the road. And there is an interesting graph in the middle. You can see that in China, the division of non-motorized, the right of way in non-motorized or motorized lane is the speed of 25 km/h. Even though that's the standard set by government for e-scooters, most of them go way faster than that, and they are in a gray area. They don't belong here or there, and that results in governance issues. And another very exciting feature is the comeback of bicycles, of initiatives led by many cities. Here I have two examples in Shanghai and Beijing. In Shanghai in 2021, the City Transport Commission issued an active mobility transport planning guideline. This guideline formally includes electric scooters as part of the active mobility system. It also established and recommended technical indicators for a citywide, well-connected active mobility infrastructure system. Beijing is also one of the pioneers in this area, and definitely the most ambitious city. In the latest transport planning, the city established that all roads over 12 meters will be equipped with separated bike lane by 2025. And lots of new forest trails in the suburb area will be built in large number. 10 forest marathon trails, 110-kilometer trail, and 1,000 short trails. As you can see from the pictures, I think both of these pictures are from Beijing. Lanes are already separated thanks to the initiatives from the last development phase, and there are clear colored marking for bikes. However, you can see that there are many e-scooters riding there. In our study, we analyzed the main challenges for active mobility development, very similar, I guess, to all cities in the world. First of all, especially in Asia, the mindset that favors private vehicle, but at both governmental level and also in the mindset of citizens, it's still most popular. They favor cars. Second is the lack of a top-level policy guidance and systematic policy framework. I mentioned some initiative from cities. However, at the central level, there is still the policies not in position, which is also why we started our national strategy program. The third is the lack of targeted and coordinated governance in the maintenance system, management system. And the fourth one is the lack of active mobility related societal group. This is very, very important, especially for the education and promotion of cycling to change the mindset. Here I have a graph about the fragmented governance. I won't go into detail of every column, but it is important to see that land use planning, tourism policy, pedestrian bike lane construction, greenway construction, the management of shared bicycle, and the management of e-scooters, each of the single function lies in a different authority. So, and there is no coordination mechanism. This makes it very difficult. In our study, we try to measure active mobility friendliness in city. How do we define that? First, we believe that an active mobility friendly city should follow the human-centered development principle. Second, it should prioritize, encourage, and be inclusive to active mobility development at policy, infrastructure, management, service, and cultural levels. Third, the measures should be citywide, should be systematic, and should be sustainable. Based on this principle, we came up with this indicator system. It consists of 4 pillars: policy, infrastructure, management and service, and culture. I will go to the next slides to show more detail. So this is our indicator system. It has 15 groups of indicators. Some of them are divided into more specific indicators. We tackle first policy, planning system, development policy, investment schemes about active mobility. Second, on infrastructure, on the road facilities, so effective width of lane, bike lane coverage rate, ratio of crossing facilities, bike lane length per capita. The environment for active mobility, greening and shading, coverage rate of barrier-free facilities, safety facilities, and parking facilities. Parking facilities are especially important for all variety of active mobility tools. And management service, we have design responsible, designated responsible institution, database and management system, service, operations, and also that's been presented by different modal. And the fourth pillar is culture, which we also see is super important in changing people's mindset. First one lies in citizen awareness. Second is education and training. Third one is PR, publicity system, recipient rate about the public, the PR system. And the fourth one lies in societal organizations and NGOs. All right, so we currently have this system, and we started our pilot project in Beijing, Chengdu, and Xiamen. Right now, we can only share some of very initial output. So in these cities, they are forerunners in China. And as you know, China is very good at building infrastructure. While in these cities, we also see city-based policy that supports active mobility. However, we see the difficulties for all of them. The most difficult parts are on the management service, also on the education. So these are some of the takeaways from our current project. In the next phase, we'll keep working with the cities and come up with city-based report. At this phase, we're only looking at piloting. Of course, in the long run, we want every city to use this indicator system, and we can rank their active mobility friendliness. But right now, we use it as a self-assessment tool for cities, and a tool for them if they really want to go far in this area, they can check what they have done and what they could have done better. So that's our current goal. And based on that, we'll soon come up with a national level cycling strategy, which will present to the Ministry of Transport and other relevant ministries. And this will be the first and only national level cycling active mobility strategy of China. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chenzi. That's really fantastic to see the work and to see the comeback of the bicycle. And once again, the messaging around protected, proper infrastructure to support these modes, and some very large-scale impressive ideas in the presentation. So thank you. We're going to keep moving through the presentations. I'm aware of the conversation happening in the chat and those questions, and we'll pick those up in our Q&A session at the end after the next two speakers. So we'll please continue to drop those in there, and we'll come back to you, Chenzi, with questions at the end. We're going to move now and talk about walking. Some great work on bicycles there, but also the vast majority of people in Asia do actually walk. And I'm very pleased to hand over to my colleague, Mr. Jim Walker, who's the founder and director of Walk21. And he's going to be talking about walking in the cities, walkability assessment methods. Over to you, Jim.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Bronwyn, and thank you also to GIZ for including us here in this session. I wanted to share a few slides with you to talk about tools and approaches that we have found particularly useful anywhere in the world, really, but I think are particularly helpful, I think maybe in an Asian context. So I just particularly was going to mention 4 tools. And if you could take me to the next slide, please. I wanted to start with realizing that the first one that we found particularly helpful is a commitment tool. This was a charter that we developed in association with more than 40 different countries, where we identified what the agenda was for walking, actually thinking about what was required, and we came up with more than 30 indicative actions that countries, cities, any community really could commit to, and know that if they actually invested in these things, it would make walking better, make walking easier and more attractive. And the thing about that tool particularly was that it created not just an agenda, but it gave a chance for a politician to then make a commitment in a way that gave citizens a chance to have a conversation with practitioners. And what we found in many places is that where practitioners are engaged with politicians and their citizens, that triangle, as it were, it is something that is very helpful to sort of not just benchmark progress, but then to sort of evolve the conversation and actually deliver change. Next slide, please. What you'll see from that is over the years, and that tool we developed in 2006, it's been signed by people all over the world, 93 different countries. This map shows you the intensity of how many signatures we've had, some in more countries than others. And maybe that's something about translations as much as anything. So I guess a call to you that if you are in an Asian city where yet this charter has been translated, please do feel free to get in touch with us and make sure that we've got a copy in your language so it can be added to the international movement. Next slide, please. In thinking about commitment, of course, it's great to sort of say, yes, of course, I want children to be able to walk to school. I want citizens to be able to get to the shops without feeling threatened or the risk of getting hurt, etc., etc. I've yet to meet a politician who wouldn't sign such a charter. But how many of those get turned into policy? Pleasingly, during COVID, we did sit down and have a chance to reflect globally about what's going on. And more than 50% of countries now, 53% you see in Asia, of countries do have some sort of policy. I'm not making a judgment here about whether the policy is any good or not. I'm just saying that they have a policy. Next slide, please. And we've been thinking about this in relation not just to whether or not there is a policy that supports walking, and you've seen some examples already today, if not existing policies of ambitions to improve that situation. But we've also seen that when we're looking at nationally determined contributions from a climate point of view, is that there is an increasing interest in making sure that walking and cycling from that point of view is actually included in their plans. Not quite yet as good as where we are with walking and cycling policies at a national level, but it's emerging. And we think this is quite interesting, particularly when you go to the next slide, please. You'll see how actually some countries have a policy for walking that isn't necessarily connected to a nationally determined contribution policy for their climate. So in the Asia region overall, and I ran out of room to put all of them on the slide, but 26 have a walking policy, 15 have a walking nationally determined contribution commitment in their climate policies, and 9 have both. And I think this is a real agenda, I think, that allows us to identify where there's an opportunity to turn existing commitments into climate commitments as well. And it may be that there are climate commitments that could be turned into policy commitments and for active travel. And that's something I wanted to just make sure people are aware that there is a gap here. Next slide, please. The second tool that we found particularly helpful is not necessarily just saying, do you have a policy or not? But as we've started to hear today, there seems to be pathways, delivery mechanisms that give us a sense of whether people are doing policies, actually being able to deliver policies in an effective way. We've built this tool to sort of explore where people are doing that well. It could be about design standards, allocating money, assessing environments, etc., etc. And this tool we found really helpful to share with people globally, the fact that there are good examples around the world that people can learn from each other. And I guess that's what this GIZ formula is particularly all about. Next slide, please. At the heart of this, we can very much think about the global agenda. We've heard about activity. People often talk about mode share. We've heard that again today. The questions really that we often ask, we could take it back to a person point of view, is how much are people walking already? Is it safe to walk? Are people within walking distance of public transport, and is it comfortable? And I think if we ask these 4 questions at any level, nationally, city, neighborhood, maybe even street level, if we could ask these 4 questions and get sensible answers, then I think we have a really good opportunity to make sure that our cities are not just walked, but walkable. Next slide, please. The third tool that we all will know about is an audit tool in thinking about how we can assess environments. And there are many of these. And in fact, Clean Air Asia did a particularly good one a few years ago now that really does help us evaluate the quality of the environment and whether or not the infrastructure that is there is reasonable and in the right place. Again, we've heard from Pasig and various places already about how to assess these things. I'm not going to talk about too much about that today, but if you look at the next slide, you'll see that how we have to think about the relationship between all these tools and the ambition of what we're trying to achieve. What I've tried to identify here is that as we'll think about in every street, and in every neighborhood, there are places that are not walked and certainly not walkable. There are plenty of places that are not particularly walkable, i.e. there's probably very little infrastructure to actually support you. However, they are often walked. And what I'm illustrating here with this graph is that there are probably 4 strategies that we need, 4 different types of approaches that are required to make sure that in places that are not walked, but they are walkable, you know, how do we get people using them and taking advantage of them? That's strategy A. In places that are walked but are not walkable, that's strategy C. What do we need to do? The places that are not walkable, do we give them up altogether, or what do we do for that is strategy B. And of course, the places that where you've got lots of walking already and it's walkable, it doesn't mean that we can take our foot off it. We need to make sure that we've still got a strategy to maintain that. And I think to try and illustrate this sort of 4-pronged approach, we really then looked back at the policy. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see how when we thought about those nationally determined contributions, it wasn't just that people were making commitments to saying, I want walking to be better. But actually, in an Asian context, look how much the commitments towards walkability improvements in terms of infrastructure, Asia is standing out here globally as where people are saying, yes, that's what we want to do. More than 70% of countries who made a commitment to walking focus particularly on the infrastructure. Interestingly, maybe not so much around land use planning, and less towards integration with public transport. And I think maybe this is a challenge for us, things that we need to be thinking about, whether or not we've got the balance right in the commitments that are being made right now, and how that might compare with other regions and how people can learn from each other. All this leads us to a point, and I guess the 4th tool, and the last one I wanted to particularly share with you, is this satisfaction tool. Because we can think about, and we should, measure safety, we should think about accessibility, we should think about the comfort levels and the numbers of people walking. All of those things matter. But ultimately, people can have really good policies. They can even be investing in infrastructure, but is it the right thing in the right place to really help keep people on their feet and protect them and make sure that they have a good experience? Not always. And this is why we've been focusing particularly on creating a tool to measure satisfaction. We think ultimately the outcome, I guess, measure that matters most to the individual is whether or not people can choose to walk if they can afford to, whether they stay on their feet or whether they choose to do something else. And if you see on the next slide, you'll see actually you had in Asia some of the best data. We often quote this study by Asia Development, Jamie Leather and others, looking from 2011, this was more than 10 years ago now, that when they asked people in cities across Asia, only 19% said that when they could afford to, they would still continue to stay on their feet unless people improved the walking experience, unless there was better investment. And so this invisibility of pedestrians that I think is across the world a global problem, because we can easily focus on the cyclists, the mopeds, you know, the buses and the cars, which are going to replace these motors. What is it that we can do? Well, last 3 slides, let me show you. The next one is we've turned that demand for safe, accessible, comfortable, dare I say even enjoyable streets into a lollipop system. We started off walking with kids and gave them lollipops and said, just put these stickers down where you feel you've had a nice experience, where you've got some concerns, where you've got some problems. And on the next slide, you'll see we've turned that into an app. This app allows you to then walk download this app, walk with it. It's called Walkability. It's in the App Store for Google and for Android now as of last week. And it allows you to walk around your neighborhood. And by sharing with us age, ability, and gender, and then the traffic light approach about whether it's green, orange for concern, or red for problem, you can then also identify the issues. It could be speed, it could be a lack of benches, it could be shade, could be drainage issues, etc., etc. We've identified a chance where people can say, this is the issue for me, this is what I like about my neighborhood, or these are the concerns that I have. Last slide. As I say, this is a tool that has literally only just gone into the App Store. So I really hope that you'll think about this. We see this as this partnership that I talked about at the beginning, that with the agenda that allows citizens to engage with their governments. Quite often, and we just heard in China, it's the lack of advocacy groups. People aren't asking for improvements to walking, and therefore often it doesn't get heard, it doesn't get delivered. But actually, every single citizen is walking. Every single citizen could engage in this app and share with governments, public transport operators, and developers the chance to say, this is where I don't feel safe, this is where I don't feel included, this is where I don't feel welcome. And I think, rather than thinking about trying to engage the whole of citizens across a whole community, think about people as destinations, at retailers, schools, hospitals, employers. These are places where people need to walk in order to these places to work successfully. And I think this tool, I hope, can be useful to you in not just allocating a sense of where is walkable and what is required, but thinking about afterwards, post-investment, a chance to then engage citizens once more and saying, did that path where I put this pathway in, where I added this crossing, where we made this junction safer, did it help? Was it enough? Did it go from red to orange, or did it go from red to green? And there, I hope we can start really being able to assess the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals, better health, better equality, better sustainable cities, and climate action. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. It is really exciting to see that tool coming on board. There is a question in the chat which you might like to pick up. As we hear from our next speaker, we will have time at the end for questions, but we are running a little tight, inevitably, in these types of discussions. So I'm very pleased now to hand over to Mr. Matteo Jare, who is from the Netherlands, and he's going to talk about the economics of cycling. So all your bike fans, we're back to bikes as part of that mix, but I know you've got a bit about walkonomics in there as well. So over to you, Matteo.
Thanks a lot, Bronwyn. If you can just give me a thumbs up if my screen is being shared correctly. Yeah, it is. Okay, perfect. Yes. So thanks a lot for having me. Yes, I will talk about cycling, but I will also mention walking, because bikeonomics really is just a term that we use for the economics of active mobility. What I'm going to talk about is basically three main topics. One is, I would say, why bother? Why is an economic approach to cycling a good approach? Not necessarily the best approach, but one of the approaches that we should apply more than we currently do. The second topic of my presentation today is about the toolkits of bikeonomics, which is a strange term, but it is interesting because it can provide you with different methods to answer different types of questions about the economics of active mobility. And I would also like to bring in a few examples of some of the work on bikeonomics that we have done in the past years. As it was mentioned, my name is Matteo Jare. I work for a company called Decisio. As you can probably hear from my accent, I am not Dutch, actually, I'm Italian. My company has two offices, one in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and one in Italy. And I always like to say that I'm Italian, actually, because I understand that when somebody from the Netherlands comes and speaks about active mobility and cycling in particular, the initial thought is always like, yeah, sure. You know, they come from the Netherlands. There, everything is easy. You cannot teach us too much. But Italy, the country I'm from, the country I do work, I do most of my project, is one of the countries definitely in Europe, and I would say in the world, in which, for example, car ownership is the highest. So it is definitely a difficult context, and it is definitely not the Netherlands. First topic that I would like to bring about, as I said, is why an economic approach to cycling and walking makes sense. Let's start from the basics. What does economics mean? If I were to ask you which words you associate with the word economics, you would probably all mention something like savings, finances, Wall Street, my balance sheet, the inflation, cash, etc., etc. All of it basically surrounding the idea of economics being related to money. And I think this is a completely wrong idea and an idea that I like to challenge, because economics really is the science of how to take decisions in conditions of scarcity. And this is really important when we talk about mobility plan. We all know that it was already mentioned many times in the presentation before, that we have to deal, with insufficient funding. The street is not wide enough, so we have a lack of space. We also have a lack of time, because climate change is really like a wall we are running towards at maximum speed. And many times we have a limited amount of political will, because the mayor or the president or whatever is going to be doing something, but sometimes their effort might be limited. So we are often in situations as mobility planners in which we have 1 year to do something, or we have one road on which we can spend our budget, or our budget is limited to €1 million, dollars, or whatever your currency is. And the question that we can try and we should try to answer is, given this limited amount of resources that I have, what is the best use that I can make of such resources? And this is really where transportation economics comes into place. We talk about budget constraints. This is just a fact of life. And economics really is, I would say, the language of power, if you want, but it also is helpful, and this is really where the presentation is going, to highlight the interconnectedness of the policy effects. The idea is that, we take cycling from being just and walking, I would say also, to being active mobility and just being mobility, I would say, to being something that actually can bring us a societal development, socio-economic, sustainable development as a whole, and that it can enhance the quality of life of our territories. And it's not just about transport, it's not just about mobility. There are also some concepts that I think Bikenomics is particularly effective at, some myths that it can dispel, I would say. The first of all being that cycling, we would love not to be bothered by cycling. We'd like to keep doing things as we always have, but it's a necessary sacrifice. We must do it, although it's very expensive. This is a myth that Bikenomics can really help dispelling, because cycling, when you study the economics of it, especially its socio-economic effects, is a cost-effective tool if you want to achieve sustainable economic development. Another myth is, we hear it a lot, cycling infrastructure is for cyclists. That's a specific category of people, but and those are like 1, 2, 3% of people, and it will disadvantage drivers. I think the same can be said for people who walk, right? I mean, if you have a job, you drive a car, right? And again, when you use Bikenomics, you can actually point at the fact that more cycling is not beneficial only for those who cycle. Yes, but actually the greater advantages, the greater social benefits are for the people who are not on a bike, and probably the most important effects are going to benefit the people who drive. And the third myth is that cycling is a partisan topic. If you are pro-cyclist, you are pro-cyclist. If you are pro-cyclist, you are an advocate of cycling, and you are against something else, and you are especially against normal way of life. And this is really I think a problem, because a lot of politicians do not want to have that label of cyclist put on them. Bikenomics can help you understand and show that if you now do not invest in active mobility, you are actually missing on a huge opportunity. It's not like not investing is for free. This is what we would like to think, either I do something now and I spend some money on cycling, at least I can also do nothing and I will save some money. If you do nothing, you don't save money. You actually continue spending a lot of money and losing a lot of socioeconomic value in keeping the business as usual, which is a suboptimal alternative. Now, how does Bikenomics or Walkonomics work? Which tools, which perspectives can we bring in to look at cycling and walking in a different way? I think there are, as I said, some typical questions that we try to answer and some different tools that we can use to answer those questions. The first question and the first lens is that of microeconomy. And it's the discussion that we have when we are trying to convince our friend or our spouse, our partner, to stop driving and walk more or cycle more. And we say, come on, you're going to save so much money in fuel. You're going to save so much money in parking expense and so on. So the microeconomic lens, the private lens, is the lens that we usually assess through what's called a financial business case. So the effects on a single traveler, a single company, a single shop in terms of pure cash. The financial business case is really, I would say, economics 101. It's really when you focus on the return for the investor. There is somebody who's willing to put in either some money or some effort and wants to know what's in it for them. Okay, so exactly, I'm going to stop driving and cycle more. I'm going to sweat. I don't want to do that because I'm lazy. So am I going to at least save some money in fuel? And the financial business case, this is very simply put, of course, but a financial business case is a tool for showing exactly that. There is a wider lens, there is a wider perspective. One that for local politicians, especially, I think it's really interesting, and it's the macroeconomic lens. What is the impact of cycling and walking on GDP, on employment, on growth, economic growth at regional level, city level, sometimes even district level? To assess this question, we use a tool that's called an economic impact assessment or economic impact study. And this is really about jobs, about economic growth, and about GDP, as I said. So the idea here is that you study how the input of a cycling project, say, for example, that your government is, it was bike sharing was mentioned, for example, or your government is willing to incentivize bike purchase. This is something that happened quite a lot in Europe during COVID, for example. And you can study how this, for example, economic stimulus is going to spread out through the economy in the different sectors of which the economy is composed. One example here is an analysis that was published, I think 3 years ago by the International Energy Agency, which, if you are familiar with, is not exactly your typical cycling advocate agency, but they studied, okay, if we are to incentivize, if we're to invest in the transport sector with the goal of creating more jobs, where is exactly better to invest, where it is most efficient, where are most jobs going to be created? And the result of the study was very interesting. Walking and cycling infrastructure provides the most jobs per €1,000,000 invested, per unit of investment, more than charging infrastructure for electric cars, which is close, way more than more traditional types of transport investment, like, for example, the production of internal combustion engine cars. So this is very interesting in terms of, exactly as I said, politicians who are trying to promote their local economy. And for example, it is also very easy to communicate because you can say, through this investment, through this policy, I create so many jobs. And there is a third and possibly the most known, I would say, perspective lens through which you can look at cycling and walking in terms of socioeconomic effects, which is the welfare economy. So the economy of the well-being of people. The speaker who just finished was mentioning in the conclusion, health, the environment, quality of life. All of these effects are always cited, always mentioned when you talk about the benefits of more walking and cycling. But bikeonomics really is interesting because it can help you say how much are those effects worth. And the cost-benefit analysis is the tool to do that. The idea is, if I'm going to invest in more cycling, €1,000,000, one unit of investment, how much money is the benefits that I'm going to generate worth? So does it make sense in collective welfare, in terms of collective welfare, to invest in more cycling or in more walking? And this is really interesting because many times we have this list of effects like the one that was shown before, health, climate change, local air pollution, less noise, etc., but we cannot sum them up. We cannot say in total, is this a lot or is this not enough? And through the cost-benefit analysis, we can monetize every single effect, associate a monetary value through different methodologies, and we can actually see this is going to be worth more or less that much, and we can compare it to the cost of investing. One example is about health, which was, again, it was mentioned before. The health effects of more cycling and more walking is not just about the healthcare costs. Of course, I do physical activity, I'm healthier, I go less to the hospital, so I'm less of a burden on the healthcare system. But it's about prolonging the life expectancy of people. It's about having people that are less sickness prone, less ill prone. So they will, when they will be 80 years old, they will have spent, and they will also continue to spend less time being sick. And it's also very interesting and also very significant in economic terms about work productivity. People that are healthier, people that are physically fit, for example, because they cycle or walk to the workplace, are more productive. Just to give you an example of an analysis that we did, this was for an Italian city, and you always have to consider that each city, each context will yield different results. But we calculated all the effects of one more kilometer, passenger kilometer in this case, driven on a car, traffic congestion, more road crashes, local air pollution, climate change, and so on. And we've also calculated the effect of one more kilometer cycled or walked. And the effect was very interesting. You basically discover, and this is, I would say, more or less the same. The numbers are different, but the overall effect is more or less always the same. If you drive a car, you are a burden to society. You are a cost. You are spreading a cost to your community, of you, of yourself, of your mobility, if you want. At the same time, and conversely, if you cycle, and even more if you walk, you are creating a social benefit. You are actually already contributing to society because of the effects of physical activity that I just mentioned. And this leads to a very interesting result. The modal shift was mentioned. How much is a modal shift? In this example, in this case study, for example, we were able to assess that shifting a person from driving a car to riding a bicycle was worth more or less 30, 35, if you want, euro cents per kilometer. If you do the same for walking, you find that the effect is even more important. The reason for that is that walking 1 kilometer requires you to burn more calories than cycling a kilometer. And so the effect on physical activity per kilometer is much higher. There is also an interesting side effect, I would say, but it's also interesting in terms of policy decisions. If you were to shift people from walking to cycling, you are actually going to lose social value. Okay, you don't want to do that. When you create cycling infrastructure, what you really want to do is take people from driving, put them on a bike, or take people from driving and let them walk. What you don't want to do, not so much, is take people that now walk and put them on a bike, because in that case, what you're going to do is that you're actually going to create a social loss. Now I understand that this might be your face, because you might be thinking, yeah, but cents per kilometer doesn't really sound like much, does it? But just in Europe in 2017, about 5,000 billion passenger kilometers were driven, and the cost associated to that much driving was in the order of 400 billion euros. And this is even not including congestion, which most of the time is actually the most significant effect. So we're talking real money here. Now, to conclude, a couple of minutes, doing and communicating some bioeconomics examples. When you communicate these effects, it can be very technical and it can be very boring. Economics usually is. But you can actually take these results and you can make them nicer, and you can make them easier to digest for everybody. And you can actually give the politicians a way and a language also to speak about these effects. This is an example of an infographic that we produced for Rotterdam in the Netherlands, but we've also worked, for example, in South America. This is the results of the social cost benefit analysis of Lima, the capital of Peru, in which basically it was shown that every sol, the local currency, invested in cycling would reap a benefit of 19 sols in socioeconomic value. So that's an investment, really, 19 times benefit to cost ratio. And in general, I think what bioeconomics is helpful for, as I said already, is to show that it's not just cycling, and it's not just walking, and it's not just mobility. The effects of more active mobility are everywhere: in health, in productivity, in education, in land use, in social policy, active mobility being a more people-oriented type of transportation. So this bioeconomics tool really is helpful for doing that. To wrap it up, long story short, an economic approach to cycling is helpful, as I said, because it takes cycling and walking out of the pure transport realm and puts it into the socioeconomic development, sustainable economic development. When you have different problems, you might want to use different tools. So you have to understand exactly what questions you're trying to answer. But also, in my experience, I've done economics for many years now, and in most cases, I would say 95% of case studies I've seen, societal benefits of more cycling and walking are very significant. Most of the times, way higher than the costs of building an infrastructure. And this is really key because we've all talked about how nice cycling and walking is, but we've also talked about how difficult it is to convince politicians and policymakers to go for it, to fund it properly. And finally, I would say that when you want to do, if you want to really reap the benefits of a bioeconomics analysis, the communication side of it is paramount, and you have to dedicate a little bit of time to doing that in order to make sure that people understand the story that you're telling. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Matteo. Italian, Matteo. I think this is a very important distinction. And that's such a fascinating conversation there, presentation about the economics. I appreciate that very much. We are going now to a Q&A session. So please, if you have some questions for our speakers, then please drop them in the chat and I will bring them to the speakers. If our participating speakers, Chenzi and Jim, if you could put your cameras on, that would be friendly. I'm going to pick up the questions that are in the chat. And they're starting with, there are a couple of questions about bikes and I'll come to those second, but I'd really like to pick up this question first because we want to see how we can learn from this session, how other cities can pick up these learnings. And I think this question touches on that very well, which is transport planning and street design guidance. This person, Keisha Mayuga, is interested in the Chinese cities. What are Chinese cities adopting around this? And because Chinese cities, Asian cities look more like each other and can learn more so than from Western street design guidelines. So from anyone from the group, maybe Chenzi, this is targeted more to you, but are there street design guidelines on active mobility for Asian cities that are publicly available that you could point Keisha to? Perhaps to you, Chenzi.
Yeah, right. Thank you to the question. Yes, the guideline that I mentioned in the presentation issued by Shanghai is available. It is publicly available. I can share a link. However, unfortunately, it is only in Chinese and it's a PDF version. So it requires some translation being done. I would also like to point out one fact that I know that Asian cities are similar. However, in China, we're looking at the mega cities, Beijing and Shanghai. So these guidelines are targeting at street that's super wide. So this might be a bit different than other cities in Asia. Yeah, but I will share the link right now.
Yeah, that's really great. And hopefully a picture speaks 1,000 words when people come to look at this guideline. And I think it is interesting, the issue about mega cities, because there is certainly a scale factor involved in the width of roads and block distances, which impact on pedestrian mobility particularly. But they certainly allow space for cycling infrastructure. And as much as that scale factor matters, when you come down to the street level experience of where people put their feet and experience their environments, it still comes down to the same elements around surfaces and safety and comfort. Jim, would you like to respond to that as well?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to pick up, in our experience, unless cities do have design guidance, it's unlikely that the delivery detail will actually work. You do need to understand that and set it. But what we see, which is evolving, is that for a long time, people assumed a sort of minimum level of service, a certain a sense of what they call level C, which is not really very good, but it's acceptable. And I don't know why, when we're talking about value, and Matteo has talked about this, why do we put up with level C as a level of service? And I think it is an opportunity to redefine that. What we've seen in Latin America is not accepting that a level of sea service based on capacity would assume that there's a 1.2 meter wide footpath as the minimum. And we know in most places around the world, we're not even getting that. But in Bogota, Colombia, they decided that the average footpath should be 12 meters wide. And because that's the main mode that everyone's doing. And the question then was put to people that if it's not 12 meters wide, then why are you choosing to make it less? And I think that's really interesting. In Asia, where we have the busiest streets in the world, what should be a minimum width? What is the acceptable level of service? I think that would be a really interesting piece of work for us to think about.
Great, thanks, Jim. I think that's really, and Keisha's added an additional comment in there in the chat about the impact of two-wheel mopeds and the city guidelines. And I think there's probably a gap here in the available resources for more of this. I know the Global Street Design Guide tried to cover everywhere, but also that you need some local development of resources as well. And in India, I know they did that for their local streets, taking into account that context. And perhaps we can see some more of that coming through. I'd like to go back to one of the first questions in the chat. And I want to pick up on this whole conversation around bike share. There's two questions in here, and the business models versus government engagement with investment in bike share. And we just heard from Matteo about the economic value of investing in walking and cycling, not just to the individual, but to the GDP, to the economy, to the health of the nation on all the measures that we have. And so the first question was about the bike share. What is the prospect for bike share in China? Are the private bike share firms changing their business models, or are local governments going to try and operate government-owned bike share? So this is a question between where the investment is coming from. And I want to keep in mind the Matteo factor about where the benefit can accrue, that it's not just an private economic model. And that brings me to the question, and that question was from Anthony from Pasig City. And I want to pick up on the question from Mega Kusuma, which is finding it sad to see the competition amongst players of app-based bike and e-bike sharing, as it's a capitalist model, and there's huge numbers of fatalities. Where's the role of government to balance the competition amongst industry players to conquer the market while maintaining the safety of consumers? So I've brought those two questions together because it's about who should be investing in bike share. Is it purely a private enterprise? And I know Europe is wrestling with this question around government regulation and the bike share industry. And how do we realize those economic benefits? So perhaps maybe Chenzi, we can come to you first around the bike share factor, and then Matteo, if you wanted to pick up on it as well in some of the work that you're doing, that would be really interesting too. Thanks.
Right, regarding bike sharing in China and the business model, I wish I have an answer for that. I think everybody wish they have an answer for that. I think my opinion is that the business model is still unclear. Many of the venture capital and private equity believe that the income does not come from the rent, however, from the data which they will use to generate advertising income in the future. However, that is not reflected right now. I believe all the bike sharing business, at least even if they belong to a bigger company, this line of business still losing money. Many of them say that the future profit channel would come from the shared e-bikes. So e-bikes, they're more expensive. Of course, the bike shares is super cheap. So the e-bike share could be the future. It is a established estimated $1 billion market in China. And regarding the question on the government action of this, yes, there are government actions nationally and locally. However, it's not from the perspective of from the investment perspective. So I don't think Chinese government at any level are especially involved in the private capital battle. However, their role are more in the governance side, on the technical standard, on the requirements of maintenance, on data collection, and most importantly, on the parking. I know that right now in the more stabilized phase, there are 3 or 4 big players in the market. So they would pay a parking fee, a very expensive parking fee to the city. And for those who would illegally park the bikes, you will be charged as well and punished. So that's the current status.
Really interesting. And I know, as I said, in Europe, they are wrestling with the layers of regulation and government framing, but it's certainly a private equity model that is bringing the vehicles into the city. Matteo, did you want to add anything around bike share and this relation, either the relationship between capital and government engagement, or just the impact generally on the economics?
Yeah, I think 2 points. Yeah, exactly, on those two different sides of the question. On the question of the bike sharing systems and yeah, exactly, the perspective of public versus private, I think you're right. In Europe, we have struggled a lot on these schemes. Exactly, who should finance it, who should be operating them, who's maintaining, if anybody, the systems. And I think what is important in that perspective is to understand what the ultimate goal of a city is to have a bike sharing system. And in my perspective, I usually I am a consultant to public administrations. 99% of the time, they are my clients. So in my perspective, I think the point of view of the public administration of a city that welcomes one or multiple bike sharing systems should be to take people from a car and put them on a shared bike. And that really should be, it's a simple objective, but many times I think this is forgotten, and it should really not be left open too much, in my opinion, to private operators, because if that happens, yeah, the logic becomes a bit different, and the logic becomes one of, I just want people to use my system. Actually, sometimes it actually becomes, I just want people to give me their data, their mobility data, which is a precious currency in that perspective. And so in that case, I think what we will be seeing, and what we actually already seen in many cities, is that either only one private operator survives and exists in one city, because the other ones cannot survive, and the competition is many times fierce. Many times these operators are actually working at a cost, or actually at a loss many times, just to destroy the competition. Or like it happens in the Netherlands, for example, the public actually takes over and the public operates. Let me just mention, I think that the Netherlands in this case really has something to teach. The bike sharing system of the Netherlands is not only public owned, it is actually owned by the rail operator of the country. And there is only one bike sharing system in the Netherlands, basically, and it is integrated in the train system. This is super important. The Dutch people go to the train station or go out from the train station and they hop on a bike, because the very same ticket unlocks a bike, and because you can find thousands, and I literally mean thousands, of bikes at the train station. So what they have, they call it the bike train system. They don't call it a bike or a train. They use the bike train as a term to define a different means of transportation. And I think this is very, very important. Yeah, that's it. I think I've already talked too much.
Great, that's a really interesting thing. So the bike is absolutely seen as an extension of the train journey and an integrated approach.
Yeah.
We are, thanks, Matteo. We are nearly at the end of our session, and so I would like to just give all of our speakers a last remark, if there's something that's come into their mind while we've been having the conversation, and then we'll go to closing remarks. Jim, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to pick up about the relationship with public transport, actually. We haven't talked much about it, but I think Matteo's really hit something very important here that we just need to remember, that actually the integration of walkability and public transport is really critical to its success in terms of sustainability and the whole system, a sustainable transport system. And I'm reminded that, it was in Hong Kong where the public transport operator is also responsible for catchment, the 500-meter catchment. And that as a model, I think is one of the best in the world, actually, to demonstrate that you're not just running a service and an efficiency, and making sure that all your system runs to time, but it's actually about making sure that people can get to your public transport, and that they ideally would also enjoy it. and I think this sort of catchment responsibility, I think, is really interesting. So I just wanted to leave that and recognize that, Asia, I think, as a region, is leading the world in some of these places. The same is true for Singapore. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Quickly, Matteo, thanks.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Thanks. I'm sorry, but Jim really mentioned something important. In a nutshell, I've talked to the rail operator in Italy, and we talked about how do they want to improve their system. And they actually say, we can improve the train as much as we want, but in order to have more people use the train, what we actually need to improve is getting to the train station, walking to the train station most of the time, or cycling to the train station. So I think this is even more important. One of the most important things in order to promote more walking is actually to talk to the public transport operators a lot. So thanks a lot, Jim, for pointing that out.
And picking up on the question before about examples from Asian cities, this is where the Asian cities can learn from each other as some of the best in the world, Singapore and Hong Kong. Chenzi, any final remarks from you? And then we'll come to closing the session.
Yeah, I would also like to pick on the topic on the integration. This is also something that's heavily debated and what we're working on. And I would, of course, have to mention the concept of mass mobility as a service, where the integration of not only public transport and active mobility, but also car sharing and private vehicle. So in the end, they're all integrated into one system, and how to make this system more oriented to public transport and active mobility is the core issue. And we are also working on that in China. We actually have a upcoming report that I would like to advertise here.
Fantastic. I think that's a great note to finish on, because we do need the integrated system of walking, cycling and public transport to be a lion's share of the solutions for the climate challenge that we face. So with that lovely segue, I'm going to hand back to Daniel Herman from GIZ for his closing remarks. Over to you, Daniel. Hopefully.
Okay, sorry, I thought that Chang would do the closing remarks, but no, then, yeah, I think we have 1 minute left, so I'm going to keep myself very brief. I thought this was, again, a very insightful display of the issues at stake in promoting active mobility. I used to work, actually, it's a few years back in Indonesia, and we have learned a lot about the challenges and the difficulties of bringing it about. But I've always found it amazing that it takes a lot of investment and with public or with politicians and local government, but that you can really have breakthrough, and that people at one point they see it, and then they become really promoters of walking and cycling when they see the potential and the quality of life it can also bring about to citizens. So I'm very grateful to all the inputs we heard today, and yeah, then and I hope you will also be able to join more of the sessions of the Transport and Climate Change Week. And then I thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you everyone for joining us. I think it's been a great blend of national ideas, local street applications in Pasig, and the broad range of issues that we've had to face. Thanks all for your time, and with that, I'm very pleased to close the session.